Hi, everybody. This week we are starting our last unit, which is postcolonialism. So, if you read the introduction, you probably are familiar with many of these terms. There are a few others that are in that introduction, but you really, I would say, need to know these ones. These are the ones that you probably want to focus on. There are some other ones that are fine if you want to look into them, but I think these are the ones that probably come up quite a bit. And the idea of postcolonialism is going to be a critical lens that deals with cultures that were colonized by another country, a European country, and that have in some way now been decolonized. So they are no longer under British control, but they are also in some ways very different from the experience. The United States does not really count as a post-colonial nation in that way because we weren't a British colony for all that long. I know we were for over 100 years, but really, as far as the effects it's had on our culture, it doesn't quite work that way. Most times when we're talking post-colonialism, you're talking a culture that is not European or with a large number of people who are not European, who are then taking on some European cultural characteristics and being, in some ways, I would say, forced to adapt themselves based on European ideas. Now, granted, there are different types of colonies. So Britain had tons of colonies, and really post-colonialism could really work with any nation that was colonized. So, the French and some other countries had a number of colonies as well. So, certainly post colonialism could apply to them too. But we usually focus on former British colonies, at least in this unit that I'm doing. But of course, like I say, French colonies like what's now Vietnam, but was then Indochina, certain parts of the Caribbean, West African nations, they could apply here too. But when you think about British colonies, you have quite a few options for that. And post colonial theory is often applied to colonies that did not have a ton of white settlers or that were not that do not today have a larger number of white settlers than they do of the native population. So that kind of leaves out Australia, New Zealand, and the US and Canada. But where postcolonialism can apply is to the native populations of those countries. So if we're talking Native Americans or Canadians or Aboriginal Australians or the Maori of New Zealand, any of those groups could certainly have a post-colonial identity and have some of these things applied to them. But it also, of course, could work well in India, as we see from Mrs. Sens. It works well in Nigeria, as we know from Things Fall Apart, and of course many other places too, where Britain had colonies all over the world. So, I'm going to go over a few terms here. Well, you know what? First, I'll tell you what, I'm going to jump to the end first and just do this crash course on imperialism. I think most of you are reasonably familiar with imperialism and with the creation of colonies. But just in case you're not, you would want to watch that video on imperialism, and we can talk briefly about it. So we do have colonialism did affect the colonized nations, the areas that were conquered by the colonizer, in a lot of negative ways. And the video goes into that. Basically, Britain and other countries took over areas of land that they thought would be beneficial to them, usually for raw materials that could then be processed into finished materials or finished products that were then resold to people in Britain, but of course also people in the colonies. So that was their probably biggest benefit. They also provided a labor force, and they provided sometimes things that you couldn't really get in Britain. For example, you can't produce rubber in Britain. Nowadays we use rubber from synthetics, but originally it came from the rubber tree, which will not grow outside the tropics. Coffee does not grow in Great Britain. Tea does not grow in Great Britain. sugar doesn't grow there either. And really, in the US, that's the case for most of the country. You could grow sugar maybe in South Florida, but for a lot of the US, you can't really grow a lot of those crops. And that's the same with France and other European countries too. So a lot of them set up these colonies to give themselves the raw materials that they wanted and needed. And it did allow them, those countries, to improve their standard of living drastically. But that was done on the backs of the people who lived in these countries and colonies. And oftentimes, as well, not only were they being taken advantage of economically, but there was also usually a racist component, and there was also usually the fact that these people were not given full citizenship. So they were taken advantage of and not really given a way to represent themselves. Like I say, it really did benefit the colonizer. Now, of course, some people at the time, many people at the time, said that this actually benefits the colonized, the native people, because they get to be exposed to all this amazing and elevated British culture, and they get to have things that they would never have had the chance to have originally. There is perhaps a nugget of truth in that, yes, it did in many ways connect these people to modernity and allow them to sort of form some of the basics for modernity in their countries, but they also were kept in a situation where they weren't really allowed to become fully modern, and they weren't ever allowed to really rule themselves, or the situation there was based too much a lot of times on colonial rule, and so there wasn't really a good place for them to jump off into ruling themselves. We're going to see later in another lecture that after World War II, many British colonies were no longer ruled by Britain. And that was a very painful process for quite a few of them to become independent countries because of some of these concepts. So when a European country like Britain takes over a different country in a different area of the world, they often bring in those British values, and they encourage those British values that they have. And that's what cultural colonization is. If you're just going to colonize an area strictly for resources, but not try to change the culture at all, that's not really good. But that's not the same as what was done by a lot of the Europeans. They brought in European culture, they brought in European religion, they brought in all these different trappings of European lifestyle, and they forced them in many ways on the native population. Now, of course, not everybody's going to start speaking English right away and valuing all these things, but over time, there is certainly a value placed on being more British and less whatever you happen to be or wherever you happen to be from. So the values that were placed on that are today seen as negative, but at the time were seen as positive. Um, Part of this was done by othering. So othering is just making somebody into something different than you, conceiving of them as something very opposite from what you are, having very opposite traits, assigning traits to them, which you often consider negative, or that you consider, you know, well, it could be either negative, and that's the demonic other. They don't literally think these people are demons, but they portray them as evil, sneaky, they cheat you, they lie, they're violent, they're aggressive, all those types of traits get assigned to a group of people. The exotic other is a little different, and it seems less harmful on the surface because they're exotically beautiful, they're different, they're often very, how should I phrase this? They're looked at in a sexual way, and they're perceived as very desirable. So all those types of things, they're this beautiful sort of sultry, carnal type of race of people. Maybe having some sort of mystical, aura about them, or having some sort of very libidinous nature, something like that. So all those things would be the exotic other. That's not great either, because both of these cases aren't realistic. They reduce people down to a simple, one-dimensional snapshot, which is not really going to apply to any one person completely, let alone an entire group of people. So othering is the process by which people, I think, made it okay to culturally colonize these people. Because if you see them as either licentious, which would be the exotic other, or evil, which is the demonic other, or just in need of moral guidance, then it's easier to foist your own ideas and colonizers' culture on them. All right, so Eurocentrism, that's pretty self-explanatory. It is saying that things that are European are the best. Things, ideas that are European, beliefs, languages, etc. They are the best, and also they are universal. The idea that those are universal. You may notice that there is definitely some overlap between this and an African American unit we did. That's because in many ways African Americans in the US have been treated in some ways like a post-colonial culture. So there is certainly overlap there. Orientalism is not the belief that the Oriental or things like it are things that are better, as in Eurocentrism. Orientalism is this idea that the East has sort of a magical, mystical component to it, and people there are wise, but they are also sort of how should I put this? It treats them basically. Remember that exotic other that I talked about? That's basically it. It's giving all those characteristics for the exotic other to a culture and saying, assigning that, and also some of those demonic othering ones, like the idea that people are lazy or that they will cheat you or whatever. This idea of it being sort of a degraded sort of culture, a culture where all these vices are either tolerated or celebrated. And by vices, I mean, cheating and lying, but also lust and gluttony and all those sorts of things. That's kind of what Orientalism is. So the Orientalist idea, it seeks to lift it up and say how interesting it is in many ways and also how mysterious it is. But again, it doesn't really represent it in any real way. It doesn't represent cultures. The reason it's called Orientalism is there were a lot more British colonies that were getting footholds in Asia before Africa. Africa was much harder to colonize, which I think they may have talked about in the imperialism chapter. It just had a lot more obstacles. Whereas India, although it had, large, huge country and many people and powerful rulers, it was also relatively simple for the British and Portuguese to gain some footholds in India. And same with China. They never colonized China, but they certainly had a trade imbalance there, and they had a lot of power there. And so a lot of those types of places got lumped into this whole Orientalism idea. There was an interest in Europe with things from the East because they were considered different or special in some way, but it also was not very realistic. Double consciousness. So a person who feels that they are not really of one culture or the other, or maybe they're of both. That's kind of a double consciousness. So if you're an immigrant and you feel like you're part of your home culture sometimes, but also sometimes not really part of it, you're part of American culture, that would kind of qualify. So you would feel like you belong to both, and maybe in different spheres you would feel like you belong to one more than the other. A lot of times people who are second generation immigrants experience this. First generation can too, but people who are born to parents who are from a different country, who maybe speak a different language and have different cultural practices. So they do one thing at home, and then at school and in the wider culture, they do something completely different that they've known since a very young age. They often experience this. Diaspora, that just means a group of people that have been spread out quite far across the world. There's often reference to the Jewish diaspora. You'll hear that. That is not the exact same as it is here because we don't consider Israel to be a post-colonial nation, but certainly there are diasporas of other groups of people as well, from a lot of different countries, a lot of different cultures. If they have been spread out across the world and maybe their culture is affecting others or connected with others, that would work. Unhomeliness is a concept I think came up with by Homi Bhabha, who's a post-colonial theorist, on homeliness is the idea that you don't really feel at home in either scenario. You never really feel